Representative Ilhan Omar thought she was walking into a routine, quiet hearing, but Senator John Kennedy was about to drop the hammer. The gavel hadn't even dropped, and already Ilhan Omar was walking into a trap she couldn't see. Senator John Kennedy was already in his seat 20 minutes early, which anyone who knew him would tell you meant something ugly was coming. He had one folder, not a binder, not a stack of research. One folder so thin you could have slid it under a door, and inside a single sheet of paper. The hearing room at the Russell Senate building was packed to the walls, media crews from every network. Activists in matching shirts, lawyers with enough paperwork to stop a tank round. The air conditioning couldn't keep up with the body heat. It smelled like perfume, photocopier, toner, and desperation. Everyone knew this was supposed to be routine oversight. A snoozer about government fraud that might get 30 seconds on C-SPAN. But when Ilhan Omar's name hit the witness list, the whole thing turned into a prize fight. Omar walked in at exactly 10:0. Chin high, purple hijab, crisp blazer tailored like armor. Behind her came a squad of K Street attorneys and staffers lugging binders, thick enough to bulletproof an SUV. She'd done the prep work, mock hearings, rehearsed answers. Her team had anticipated every Republican dog whistle, every racist trope, every bad faith question they thought Kennedy might throw. She was ready, she just wasn't ready for John Kennedy. He smiled when she sat down, not the camera ready. Polished smile politicians practice in mirrors. This was the warm crinkle, lied grin of a grandfather who just spotted his favorite grandkid walking up the porch steps. Representative Omar, he said that Louisiana draw pouring out slow as molasses on a winter morning. Thank you for accepting our invitation. I want you to know before we start, I appreciate you being here genuinely. Some folks in your position would have refused. Takes courage to show up, her lead attorney shifted. Compliments from John Kennedy were like an alligator's back floating just above the waterline. Calm on top, everything with teeth underneath. I also want to say something else, Kennedy continued, adjusting wire-rimmed glasses that made him look less like a senator and more like a small-town pharmacist. Your story is remarkable. I mean that little girl flees a civil war, loses her mother, spends years in a Kenyan refugee camp, then becomes a United States congresswoman. He paused, and the pause felt genuine. That is the American dream with a capital A. My daddy would have pointed to you at the dinner table and said, "See, that's why this country is special." A few of Omar's supporters nodded. This wasn't the ambush they braced for. Maybe the old man had gone soft. Omar allowed herself a cautious smile. Thank you, Senator. I appreciate those words. I meant every one of them, Kennedy said. Then he put on his reading glasses, opened that wafer-thin folder with the casualness of a man unfolding a napkin, and glanced at the single page inside. Now, ma'am, I just have a few simple questions, nothing complicated. I'm a simple man from a simple state, and I like simple answers. He looked up over the rims. I'm just trying to understand some numbers that don't quite add up. The camera caught it. The micro flicker in Omar's eyes. Less than a second, but it said everything. She knew in that instant what everyone who'd ever watched Kennedy dissect a witness already understood. Simplicity from this particular senator was the sharpest blade in Washington. Of course, Omar said, voice steady. I'm happy to answer any questions. Kennedy smiled again. Well, then let's start with something easy. He looked at his paper, then back up with an expression of genuine, almost innocent confusion, like a man who'd found a raccoon in his kitchen and was honestly perplexed about how it got past the dog. Ma'am, I've been looking at your financial disclosures, the ones you filed with the clerk of the House under penalty of perjury. Let that last phrase float gently into the microphone. In 2023, you reported assets of about $250,000. Does that sound right? That's approximately correct, Omar said. Student loan debt, some credit card debt, a working mom trying to make ends meet in two expensive cities, Minneapolis and Washington. I understand cost of living is tough everywhere. Omar nodded. She was on comfortable ground. Relatable, human, but then I looked at your 2024 disclosure. Kennedy continued, still wearing that puzzled expression like he was trying to solve a crossword clue. And ma'am, I have to tell you, I thought there was a typo because according to what you filed, your assets jumped to somewhere between $6 million and $30 million. He looked up in 1 year. The number hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. So I put my glasses on and read it again, and it wasn't a typo. Kennedy scratched the back of his head, a gesture so folksy it practically came with its own banjo riff. Now, ma'am, I was state treasurer of Louisiana for 21 years. I've seen thousands of financial statements, seen them go up, seen them go down, but I have never in my entire career seen anyone go from a $250,000 to $30 million in 12 months. He paused, and when he spoke again, his draws slowed to the speed of cold honey. Where I come from, we call that either a miracle or a whole lot of explaining, and since you don't appear to have found the Ark of the Covenant, I'm hoping for the explaining. Scattered laughter rippled through the gallery. Even a few Omar supporters cracked smiles. Kennedy's humor was like that. It disarmed you right before the blade came through. My husband's business ventures experienced significant growth, Omar said, delivering the rehearsed line smoothly. He operates Rose Lake Capital, a venture capital firm, and East Street Group, a winery in California. Business valuations can fluctuate substantially. They sure can, Kennedy agreed. Amiable as a golden retriever. So let's talk about those businesses. He glanced at his sheet. One quick look. Hummingbird Fast, Rose Lake Capital, your husband's venture capital firm. Now, there were some court proceedings in 2024 involving Mr. Mimet's businesses. Discovery documents were filed, and according to those documents, he read slowly, deliberately, Rose Lake Capital had $4,244 in its bank account. He looked up $42, and the winery East Street Group had 5 cents a nickel. Kennedy held up his thumb and forefinger, almost touching. I couldn't buy a stick of gum with what was in those accounts. He set down the paper. Now you're telling this committee that a company with $42 in the bank is worth between $5 and $25 million. Ma'am, that's like me telling you my neighbor's three-legged hound is worth a Ferrari because it might chase a rabbit someday. The math just doesn't work. More laughter, louder this time, but underneath it, something had shifted. The reporters weren't smiling anymore. They were writing. Omar's composure held, though her lead attorney was already leaning in. She waved him off. Business valuations are based on projected future earnings. Intellectual property and deal pipelines, Senator, not just bank balances. I'm sure the treasurer of Louisiana understands that. Oh, I do, Kennedy said, pleasant as pie. I also understand that when a company's bank account can't cover a Happy Meal and its projected value is $25 million, somebody's either a genius or a liar. He held up a hand quickly. Now I'm not saying which. I'm just saying those are the two options. He shifted forward slightly. But here's what really puzzles me. In February 2025, you told Business Insider, and I'm quoting, I am not a millionaire. I am a working mom with student loan debt. That was after you filed the disclosure showing up to $30 million in assets. He pulled his glasses down his nose and looked at her over the rims. So, which is it? Are you a working mom with student loans, or are you worth $30 million? Because you told the public one thing and you told the government under penalty of perjury something very different. Omar's jaw tightened. My husband's assets are reported on my disclosure as required by house rules. That doesn't mean they are my personal, ma'am. Kennedy interrupted, gentle as a Sunday school teacher correcting a child. When you file a financial disclosure that says $30 million and then you tell a reporter you're not a millionaire, one of those statements is false. I can't tell you which one, but I can count to 30 million, and I can count student loan debt. And those two numbers don't live in the same neighborhood. The progressive section of the gallery had gone quiet. Not hostile quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a room when people stop cheering and start actually listening. Kennedy leaned back, his chair creaking like it had opinions of its own. Now that's just the numbers, and numbers are cold things. They don't have feelings, they don't have religion, they don't have politics. They just are. He closed the folder. He wouldn't open it again. Let's talk about where some of those numbers might have come from. Shall we discuss the Meals Act? Kennedy took a sip of water from a paper cup. A small human gesture that made you forget you were watching. Senate hearing and feel instead like you were sitting in a living room while a sharp old man told a story that would end somewhere devastating. In 2020, he began You Sponsored the Meals Act. The idea was to make it easier to feed hungry children during COVID. Kids who depended on school lunches were going without. Real problem, serious problem, and your bill was supposed to help. He nodded almost to himself. I voted for similar programs. Nobody wants children to go hungry. That's not a Republican position or a Democrat position. That's a human being position. Omar straightened. This was territory she prepared for. The Meals Act expanded access to federal nutrition programs at a time when millions of children. I know what it did on paper. Kennedy said, let me tell you what it did in practice. His voice lost exactly 1 degree of warmth. Just one. But in the silent room, everyone felt the temperature drop. $250 million was stolen. $250 million. Not lost. Bureaucratic waste, not eaten up by overhead. Stolen by criminals who exploited the program your bill created. He let the numbers sit. Now, here's how it worked for the folks watching at home. People in Minnesota set up daycare centers. On paper, these centers were feeding hundreds of children every day. The federal government, using the framework your bill expanded, sent money to pay for those meals. Kennedy's draw deepened the way it always did right before the killing blow. But there was a problem. Those daycare centers weren't feeding anybody. Some of them had no children at all. Reporters found buildings with locked doors and dark windows that were billing the government for thousands of meals a day. Shell companies, fake invoices, fake attendance sheets, fake everything. He looked at Omar. 78 people have been indicted, 57 convicted, and these weren't masterminds, ma'am. Some of them tried to bribe a juror with $120 in cash stuffed in a paper bag. That's not organized crime. That's brazen theft by people who believed nobody was watching. Kennedy's voice dropped. Piero, you know who I keep thinking about, not the criminals, the children. The room shifted. Something in his tone had changed from prosecutor to preacher. There's a 7-year-old girl in Cedar Riverside. I don't know her name, but she exists. She was supposed to get lunch through this program. Her mama works 2 jobs. School was closed because of CO. The government promised that girl a meal. Your bill was supposed to deliver that meal. He paused. But the money that was supposed to buy that little girl's lunch went into a shell company in Minneapolis. From there, it went into a wire transfer. And from there, it bought a Mercedes-Benz for a man who has never fed a hungry child in his life. 2 women in the gallery, Omar supporters who'd arrived wearing Defend Ilhan shirts, looked down at their laps. That little girl went hungry, ma'am, not because the government didn't care. Not because there wasn't enough money. She went hungry because the money was stolen through a program you sponsored. Omar found her voice carrying the edge of someone who'd practiced this response a dozen times. Senator, I was one of the first members of Congress to call for an investigation into this fraud. I sent a letter to the Secretary of Agriculture when, excuse me, Kennedy asked, when did you send that letter? Before or after the journalist exposed the fraud? Silence. Because I have the letter, ma'am. It's dated after the story broke. Not before, not during, after. When the cameras were already rolling. And the indictments were already coming. He scratched his chin. Now, maybe that's a coincidence. Maybe you were writing that letter at the exact same moment reporters were publishing their stories. But here's what bothers me. He counted on his fingers like a man tallying a grocery list. 1. The program your bill created was exploited for $250 million. Phone. The majority of the convicted fraudsters are from your district in Minnesota. 3. Some of those fraudsters donated to your campaign. Donations you returned after they were caught, not before, after. He held up a 4th finger. And 4. In the same period this fraud was exploding, your family's net worth jumped from $250 to $30 million. He looked at her and the last of the warmth had drained from his expression. Now I am not accusing you of anything. I want to be very clear about that. I am asking questions. That's my job. And so far, you have not given me a single answer that makes the math work. Omar's lead attorney leaned forward. Senator, you are drawing connections that don't exist. Representative Omar had no knowledge of or involvement in. I'm talking to the representative. Kennedy said, not Unkindly, she's a grown woman. She can speak for herself. He turned back to Omar, unless you'd rather have your lawyer answer for you. Omar's eyes flashed. I can answer for myself. Then answer this. $250 million stolen from a program you sponsored. Your net worth jumps $30 million in a year. You return campaign donations from convicted fraudsters, but only after they were convicted. Don't those numbers bother you? I find it deeply offensive that you would imply, ma'am. The only thing I'm implying is that a $4 billion was stolen from hungry children. If that doesn't bother you, we have bigger problems than your financial disclosure. The room had gone church quiet, the kind of quiet where you can hear a photographer's shudder from 50 feet away. Kennedy reached for his water cup again. Peril, money is money. Let's talk about something more personal. He took a sip. Let's talk about Mr. Tim May. He set down the cup and folded his hands on the table, looking like a Sunday school teacher about to address an uncomfortable parable. Ma'am, your campaign Omar for Congress paid approximately $78 million to a company called Air Group. Is that correct? My campaign used East Street Group for legitimate consulting services, Omar said carefully. Digital advertising, fundraising, mail production, $78 million worth, Kennedy repeated. Now, East Street Group is owned by Mr. Tim May, who is currently your husband, but at the time those payments began, he was married to someone else, a woman named Beth May. Omar's attorneys were already shuffling papers, pens moving, heads leaning together, and during the time your campaign was paying his company millions of dollars, you were having a romantic relationship with Mr. Maymat. Kennedy didn't phrase it as a question. He didn't need to. His wife at the time found out and she filed for divorce. He pulled a single sheet from inside his suit jacket, not from the folder, from his jacket, as if he'd been carrying it close to his heart. Now, I normally wouldn't read someone's divorce filing in a public hearing. That's private pain, and I respect private pain, but Mrs. Beth Maymat's words were given under oath in a court of law, and they directly involved the use of campaign funds. So, I hope you'll forgive me. He reads slowly, not for dramatic effect, but slowly, the way you read something that deserves to be heard by every person in the room. Mrs. Maymat stated under oath in her divorce deposition, "My husband told me in April 2019 that he was having an affair with Congresswoman Omar. He said he had been traveling with her on campaign trips that I now believe were personal in nature. When I asked how they could afford all this travel, he said, 'Don't worry about it.' Ilhan's campaign is covering everything." Kennedy set the paper down. Ilhan's campaign is covering everything. The gallery was motionless. Now, campaign money is not a magic fund, ma'am. Campaign money comes from donors, real people, working people in Minneapolis who gave $20 or $50 because they believed in you. A grandmother on a fixed income, a young man saving for college, a single dad who skipped his coffee for a week so he could contribute. Kennedy's jaw deepened. Those people didn't donate to fund anyone's love life. They donated because they thought their money was going to democracy. Instead, it went to hotels, suites, and romantic dinners, and travel for two to places where no campaign events were scheduled. Omar's face had hardened into that defiant expression she wore on cable news. Those were legitimate campaign expenditures that were properly reported. Were they? Kennedy leaned forward because the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board found that you used $469 in campaign funds for personal travel. They also found you used campaign funds to pay for personal tax preparation, specifically to correct those joint tax returns you filed with a man you weren't married to. We'll get to that in a moment. He held up a finger. Pero, my personal favorite, and I use that word loosely, is this. You used campaign funds to pay your divorce attorney. You were divorcing Mr. Elmy so you could marry Miss May, whose company you were paying $2. $78 million in campaign funds. Kennedy sat back and looked at the ceiling as if performing complex arithmetic in his head. So let me see if I've got this straight. Campaign donors gave you money. You used that money to pay a man you were sleeping with. Then you used more of that money to divorce your husband. Then you married the man you were paying, and then you kept paying him. He looked at Omar. "Ma'am, where I come from, that's not a political campaign. That's a business plan." The sound that came from gallery was not laughter. It was the sharp collective inhale of people who had just heard something they couldn't unhear. One of Omar's staffers in the back row put her face in her hands. "Kennedy, Wasn't done, bro. Here's what really gets me. After all of this became public, the affair, the payments, the divorce, you cut ties with E Street Group. You said it was to avoid the appearance of impropriety, but by then the company had already received $2, 78 million. He rubbed his temples. That's like robbing a bank, returning the empty bag and saying, you want to avoid the appearance of bank robbery, the money's already gone. Omar turned to her attorney's urgent whispers. The lead attorney straightened his tie, a nervous habit, Senator. Omar said, voice tight. I have addressed these campaign finance matters extensively. I have cooperated with every inquiry, and I find it deeply troubling that you are using a woman's divorce, a painful personal matter, as political theater. Kennedy nodded slowly. Ma'am, I agree with you. Divorce is painful, which is why I feel for Mrs. Beth Mymet. She didn't ask for any of this. She didn't run for Congress. She didn't sponsor any bills. She was a wife who found out her husband was having an affair with a congresswoman, and that the congresswoman's campaign was footing the bill. He looked directly at Omar. You want to talk about painful personal matters, Mrs. Mymet had her marriage destroyed and had to learn it was funded by campaign donors. Where's your sympathy for her? Omar opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. Kennedy let the silence breathe, then quietly. Now, I promised I'd ask simple questions, so here's the simplest one yet. He removed his glasses and set them carefully on the table. When he spoke again, his jaw was still there, but something underneath had turned to steel. Can you tell this committee under oath who Ahmed Nur Ilmi is to you? The hearing room had changed. Not physically the same marble columns, the same brass fixtures, the same portraits of dead senators staring down from the walls, but the air had changed. The energy Omar's supporters had brought into the room, the defiance, the solidarity, the righteous certainty had evaporated like morning dew on hot asphalt. Kennedy sat perfectly still. Without his glasses, his face looked different now, sharper. The folksy grandfather had packed up and gone home. What remained was a man who'd graduated magna cum laude from Oxford, who'd spent 2 decades counting every dollar in Louisiana's treasury, and who had not asked a single question today that he didn't already know the answer to. Ahmed Nur sent Elmi Kennedy repeated, you legally married him in 2009, Hennepin County, Minnesota, marriage certificate on file, is he your brother? The question landed like a brick through a stained glass window. Omar's lead attorney was on his feet before she could respond. Senator, this line of questioning is based on thoroughly debunked conspiracy theories rooted in Islamophobia and xenophobia. My client, Counselor Kennedy, said, I asked a yes or no question. I didn't ask for a press release. He turned back to Omar. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Is Ahmed Nur, said Elmi, your biological brother, yes or no? Omar straightened in her chair. Her voice carried the practiced steel of a woman who'd answered this question 100 times on cable news. No, he is not my brother. That allegation is a baseless racist conspiracy theory that has been debunked. Thank you. Kennedy said he's not your brother. You've said so under oath. That's on the record. He paused. Now, since he's not your brother, and since this is a conspiracy theory that you say has caused you great personal pain for nearly a decade, why not end it today? Omar's eyes narrowed. What do you mean, a DNA test? Kennedy said simply. Quick, painless, one swab. Results in a week. If he's not your brother, the test proves it. Conspiracy theory dead and buried. Nobody can ever bring it up again. You win forever. The room held its breath. I will not submit to a degrading. The Daily Mail asked you in 2019. Kennedy continued as if she hadn't spoken. You refused. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune asked you. You refused. Fox News refused. Congressional investigators refused. Tom H. Mann refused. He spread his hands on the table. If this man is not your brother, one cotton swab makes every question I'm asking right now disappear. It vindicates you completely, permanently. He looked at her, so I asked again with genuine respect. Why won't you do it? Omar's attorneys were in full conference mode, whispers flying like sparrows in a barn. Omar sat rigid, jaw working, eyes locked on Kennedy with an intensity that could have melted the Senate seal off the wall behind him. She said nothing. Kennedy let the silence last 5 seconds, 10:15. The silence was louder than anything either of them had said all morning. I'll take that as a continued refusal, Kennedy said quietly, and the American people can decide for themselves what that refusal means. He shifted gears, not abruptly. Kennedy never did anything abruptly, but with a smooth, unhurried certainty of a man steering a John boat through familiar bayou channels. Let's talk about what we do know. Facts, records, no conspiracy theories needed. He glanced at his single sheet of paper, which by now felt less like a document and more like a loaded weapon. While you were legally married to Mr. Elmi, you filed joint federal tax returns with Mr. Ahmed Hersey in 2014 and 2015. Is that correct, Omar's lead attorney? My client is not going to address, ma'am. Kennedy said, looking past the attorney directly at Omar. Did you file joint tax returns with Mr. Hersey while legally married to Mr. Elmi? A long pause. On the advice of counsel, the Minnesota Campaign Finance Board already answered this question for you. Kennedy said in their investigation, they confirmed that you filed joint returns with Hersey while legally married to Elmi. That's not a conspiracy theory, ma'am. That's your signature on a federal tax return. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. Now, I'm not a tax lawyer. I'm just a country senator from Louisiana. But even I know that filing a joint tax return with someone who is not your legal spouse is a federal offense. 26 U.S. Code Section 7206, willfully filing a fraudulent return. Up to 3 years in federal prison and a $250,000 fine. He let the statute citation hang in the air, and there's something else that puzzles me. In 2017, when you filed for divorce from Mr. Elmi, you submitted an application for service by alternate means. In that document, you stated under oath that you'd had no contact with Mr. Elmi since June 2011. Kennedy looked up Perro. In 2015, you posted photographs on your Instagram account under your nickname, Hawo, of a trip to London. In those photographs, you are standing next to Mr. Elmi. He let the contradiction speak for itself. So you told a Minnesota, a court, you hadn't seen this man since 2011. But in 2015, you were posting pictures with him in London. Ma'am, those two things cannot both be true. One of them is perjury. Omar's second attorney, the one who hadn't spoken all morning, pulled out a legal pad and began writing what was either a very important note or a very urgent resignation letter. Kennedy leaned back, the chair creaking that same sympathetic creak, as if even the furniture knew what was coming. Ma'am, I've been asking questions in Senate hearing rooms for 8 years now. Before that, I spent 21 years in Louisiana state government. I've questioned hundreds of witnesses, maybe thousands. Good people, bad people, confused people, scared people. His voice softened to something almost tender, and I've learned one thing that has never failed me. Innocent people answer questions. They answer quickly, clearly, and completely, because the truth is easy. It doesn't require preparation. It doesn't require lawyers. It doesn't require refusing DNA tests or invoking the Fifth Amendment or posting Instagram photos that contradict court filings. He looked at Omar. Innocent people have nothing to hide. Guilty people have nothing to say. The gallery was silent. Not the charged silence of anticipation. The hollow silence of people watching something collapse. Pirro, we have one more subject to cover, Kennedy said. And this one isn't about money, it isn't about marriages, it isn't about tax returns. His voice changed. The draw didn't disappear. It couldn't any more than the Mississippi could stop flowing south. But something beneath it shifted like bedrock moving. This one's about 977 Americans who went to work one morning and never came home. Kennedy removed his glasses and placed them in his jacket pocket. He wouldn't need them for this. He didn't need a sheet of paper. He didn't need notes. What he was about to say had been living inside him for years, and it didn't require a script. The room felt it. Every person in that gallery, progressive, conservative, media, staff, felt the atmospheric pressure dropped the way animals feel a storm before it arrives. Kennedy had spent the hearing being funny. He'd made the gallery laugh. The humor had been his instrument. He put it down. Now, what replaced it was something the hearing room had not yet seen from the senior senator from Louisiana. Uncut moral conviction. In 2019, Kennedy began and his voice was lower, slower, stripped of every ornament. You spoke at a fundraiser for the Council on American Islamic Relations, and you said the following words. He didn't read them. He recited them from memory, the way a man recites a wound. CARE was founded after 9/11 because they recognized that some people did something. He stopped, he looked at the table for a moment, then back up. Some people did something. The words fell like stones into a well that had no bottom. On the 11th of September 2001, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. They flew 2 of them into the World Trade Center in New York City. They flew 1 into the Pentagon. The passengers of the 4th, ordinary Americans, ma'am, not politicians, not celebrities, ordinary people, fought back, and that plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Kennedy's voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. 977 people were murdered that day. Murdered, ma'am. Not casualties of something, murdered. Firefighters ran into buildings that were burning and collapsing knowing they would not come out. They ran in anyway. 343 of them died. Paramedics, police officers, Port Authority workers, people whose job was to save strangers. And they did it, and they died doing it. He paused. The gallery was absolutely motionless. A woman in the 3rd row was crying silently. People jumped from the 80th floor rather than burn alive. Jumped, ma'am, from a quarter mile in the sky because that was better than the alternative. Wives called their husbands from inside those buildings to say goodbye. Husbands called their wives. A flight attendant named Betty called American Airlines from seat 3R of Flight 1 and calmly reported the hijacking while the plane was being flown into the North Tower. She was 45 years old. Kennedy looked at Omar, and you called it something done by some people. Omar opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy raised one hand. Not sharply, not angrily, just a slow, deliberate lift of the palm that said, not yet. I have defended publicly on this floor on camera your right to criticize Israel. Policy disagreements are American. Disagreeing with a foreign government's actions is American. I have never and will never say that criticizing Israel makes someone an anti-Semite. His voice hardened. Pirro, that is not what you do, ma'am. In 2019, you said support for Israel was all about the Benjamins, baby. You reduced the Jewish people's deepest geopolitical cause to a bribe. You were forced to apologize by your own party. He counted on his fingers. In 2021, you compared the United States and Israel to Hamas and the Taliban. Your own Democratic colleagues, not Republicans, Democrats, issued a statement condemning you. Another finger. In 2023, your own party voted to remove you from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, not because of policy differences, because of a pattern of rhetoric that your own colleague found indefensible. Another. In 2024, you visited Columbia University and called Jewish students pro-genocide students. Ma'am, young people exercising their right to disagree with you. And you labeled them pro-genocide. He set his hand down. That's not criticism of Israel. That's a pattern, and patterns have names. Kennedy's draw, which had faded during this passage like color draining from a photograph, returned now, but it returned changed, weighted, carrying something heavy. I represent Louisiana. You know what my people do. They fish, they farm, they build ships, they cook best food in America, and they don't charge you $1.40 for it. They go to church on Sunday and coach Little League on Saturday. They don't have venture capital firms. They don't have winery valuation that jump from a nickel to $25 million. His voice cracked, not much, barely a fracture in the foundation, but in the absolute silence of the hearing room, everyone heard it. Pirro, they pay taxes, and their taxes fund federal nutrition programs. Programs that under your bill were looted for $250 million. Their taxes pay your congressional salary $174.0. 0 a year while you minimize the worst attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Their taxes support the system that gave you a refugee from Somalia, the opportunity to become a United States Congresswoman. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't even raising his voice, but every word carried the weight of a man who'd spent 40 years listening to people from Shreveport and Baton Rouge and Lake Charles and Nachos who'd heard their frustrations and their hopes and their anger, and who was speaking for them now in the only room that mattered. My people deserve better than this. Your people, the people of Minnesota's 5th District, deserve better than this. All Americans deserve better than this. The woman in the third row was still crying. She wasn't the only one anymore. Kennedy looked at Omar for a long time. She stared back for the first time all day. There was no defiance in her eyes, no anger, no rehearsed response. Just the hollow expression of a woman who had come to this hearing expecting to fight a political battle and had instead been confronted with something she had no weapon against. The truth delivered without malice, without theater, without anything but the plain grief of a man who loved his country and was watching it be taken for granted. I have one final question. Ma'am, Kennedy said he stood up. He had been seated for the entire hearing, through all the questions, through the humor and the evidence and the slow accumulation of damage. And his standing now carried the force of punctuation, a period at the end of a very long sentence. Representative Omar, he said, and his use of her title was deliberate, not hostile, not mocking, but precise, a reminder that titles carry obligations. You came to the United States as a refugee. You were a child. Your mother had passed away. Your family fled a civil war. You spent years in a camp in Kenya, waiting for a country to take you in. He paused, and America took you in. The room was still. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. This country gave you asylum, gave you safety, gave you an education, gave you citizenship, gave you the right to vote, the right to speak freely, the right to practice your faith. And then this is the part that amazes me. This country gave you the right to run for office to represent the very people who welcomed you. Kennedy's voice carried something rare for a politician: wonder. Genuine wonder at the thing he was describing. You became a state legislator, then a United States Congresswoman, a refugee from a camp in Kenya, became a member of the United States House of Representatives. Ma'am, there is no other country on earth where that story is possible. Not one. He looked at her. So my final question is this, and it's not a trick question. It's not a legal question. It's the question that every taxpayer in this country has the right to ask. He spoke slowly, each word carrying its full weight. What have you done with that gift? The question floated across the hearing room like a hymn in an empty church. You sponsored a bill that was exploited to steal $250 million from hungry children. Your net worth jumped from nothing to $30 million in a year. And you can't explain how. You used campaign money donated by working people to fund your personal life, your divorce, your boyfriend's company. You filed false tax returns. You refused to answer basic questions about your marriage history. You called the murder of 977 Americans something. You have spread hatred against Jewish people so consistently that your own party removed you from a committee. He let the list settle. America gave you everything, ma'am, everything. The question isn't what America owes you. The question is what you owe America, and based on what I've seen today, the answer is an apology, an explanation, and about $250 million. Omar's last defense was the only one she had left. She leaned into the microphone and her voice shook, not with weakness, but with a particular fury of a person who had run out of arguments and was reaching for the last weapon in the arsenal. Senator Kennedy, what you have done today is an act of racism. You have targeted me because I am a black Muslim immigrant woman. Every question you have asked has been designed not to seek truth, but to dehumanize me and delegitimize my presence in Congress. This is exactly the kind of ma'am, Kennedy said, and his voice was so quiet the microphone barely caught it. I haven't mentioned your race. I haven't mentioned your religion. I haven't mentioned your gender, not once. I haven't talked about money, tax returns, campaign funds, a bill that led to $250 million in fraud, and your own words about 9/11. He stepped away from the table. You keep telling America that anyone who questions you is a racist. Pearl, you can't answer the questions. And at some point today, specifically, the American people are going to notice that every time you're asked a question you don't like, you call the questioner a bigot. That's not a defense, ma'am. That's a confession that you don't have one. The silence that followed was the kind that ends careers. At that moment, the committee chairman cleared his throat and read a statement into the record. The Department of Justice and the House Ethics Committee had opened formal inquiries into Representative Omar's financial disclosures, campaign expenditures, and tax filings. The Treasury Department's investigation into potential links between Minnesota, fraud funds, and foreign entities would be expanded. A separate review of the Meals Act oversight failures was being referred to the Inspector General. Omar's attorneys gathered their binders. Her staffers who had arrived that morning with righteous energy and matching T-shirts were already filing out heads down, phones pressed to ears. On the defend, Ilhan signs disappeared from the gallery, folded and tucked into bags like flags after a surrender. A Democratic colleague, a member of the committee who had sat silently through the entire hearing, leaned into his microphone. "I want to note for the record," he said carefully, his voice carrying unmistakable cadence of a man building distance between himself and a sinking ship, that oversight and accountability are bipartisan values. Every American, regardless of party, deserves honest representation. He didn't look at Omar when he said it. He didn't need to. Kennedy gathered his folder, still thin, still containing only one sheet of paper, and slipped it into his jacket. He hadn't opened it since the beginning. He hadn't needed to. Every devastating revelation had come from public records, published reports, and Omar's own words. The folder was almost irrelevant. The weapon had never been the documents. The weapon had been the questions. He nodded to the chairman, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the exit. Perao, he stopped just for a moment, just long enough to turn back to Omar, who sat alone at the witness table. Attorneys packing, staffers gone, supporters vanished. "Ma'am," he said, "where I come from, we have a saying. You can call a skunk a rose all you want, but the smell don't lie." He adjusted his glasses. "For 7 years, you've been telling America that skunk is a rose. Today, the perfume wore off." He turned and walked through the door. Cameras followed him. As cameras do, they follow the person who still has power, not the one who just lost it. Behind him, Ilhan Omar sat at the witness table. The microphone in front of her was still on, the red light still glowing, but she had nothing left to say into it. The room emptied around her like water draining from a sink. And when it was done, she was alone with the marble columns and the brass fixtures and the portraits of dead senators who stared down from the walls with expressions that, if you caught them at the right angle, looked an awful lot like judgment. Hearing ended at 3:22 p.m. Eastern Time. By 3:30, the clip of Kennedy's skunk and rose line had been viewed 6 million times. By 4:00, 12 million. By the time most Americans sat down for dinner, the number had lost all meaning. It was everywhere on every platform in every language. 12 words that captured in a single breath what the entire hearing had taken 4 hours to prove. The network split along predictable lines. Fox News led with Kennedy dismantles Omar in historic hearing. CNN ran with contentious Senate hearing raises serious questions about Omar's finances. MSNBC spent uncomfortable 40 minutes trying to frame it as a Republican attack on a woman of color before a panelist, a former federal prosecutor, quietly noted that the financial discrepancies Kennedy identified were in fact legitimate subjects of inquiry. The panel moved on quickly. Omar's team released a statement at 6:15 p.m. 4 paragraphs of boilerplate. Racist attacks, Islamophobic, targeting manufactured controversy. The statement was notable for what it did not contain answers. Not one of Kennedy's questions was addressed. Not the net worth discrepancy, not the Rose Lake capital valuation, not the campaign payments to Mimit, not the tax filings with Hersey. The absence of answers was by that point the only answer that mattered. Within 48 hours, 3 developments reshaped the landscape. First, the House Ethics Committee announced it would conduct a formal review of Omar's financial disclosures, a rare step that required bipartisan agreement, meaning at least some Democrats had signed on. Second, the Department of Justice confirmed through a spokesperson that financial matters related to Representative Omar's disclosures were under active review. Third, and most devastating, 2 progressive organizations that had publicly defended Omar for years issued carefully worded statements expressing concern about the financial discrepancies and calling for full transparency. In Washington, concern is the word allies use right before they become former allies. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune published a front-page investigation 3 days after the hearing, tracing the timeline of Rose Lake Capital's valuation from $42 to $25 million. The article ran 400 words and concluded with a quote from a forensic accountant. In 30 years of examining financial statements, I have never seen a valuation increase of this magnitude without a clear documentable event. A funding round, an acquisition, a major contract. None of those appear to exist here. Omar's response was to call the Star Tribune's investigation part of a coordinated right-wing campaign. The Star Tribune, which had endorsed her in 3 consecutive elections, did not respond. The feeding. Our future case continued its slow grind through the federal courts. The conviction count climbed past 60. Sentencing hearings produced testimony from program administrators who described in meticulous detail how shell companies had been created, how fake invoices had been generated, and how millions of dollars had been wired to accounts overseas. In one particularly damning hearing, a cooperating witness testified that the fraud had been so easy, so lacking in oversight that participants had joked about it. We called it free money, the witness said. Nobody was checking, nobody cared. Kennedy gave no victory lap. He gave one interview, just one, to a local Baton Rouge station. It was conducted on the porch of his home in Madisonville, Louisiana, a small town on the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. He sat in a wicker chair that had seen better decades, wearing khakis and a polo shirt, looking less like a United States senator than like a man who was about to go fishing. I don't enjoy that sort of thing, he said when asked about the hearing. Some folks think I do. They see the one-liners, the jokes, and they think it's entertainment. It's not. It's frustration. When you see public servants betraying the public trust and nobody asks the obvious questions, the frustration has to go somewhere. For me, it comes out as humor. Pero underneath humor, I promise you there's nothing funny about any of it. The interviewer asked about Omar's accusation that the hearing was racially motivated. Kennedy looked out at the lake. A pelican was diving for fish about 50 yards from shore, graceful from a distance, chaotic up close. I've been called a lot of things in my career, he said. Racist isn't one that sticks because my record speaks for itself. I've fought for flood insurance for communities that are majority black and majority poor. I've secured federal money for hospitals in parishes where the nearest emergency room is an hour away. I've never in my entire life made a decision based on the color of someone's skin. He looked back at the camera. I asked questions about money, about tax returns, about campaign finance, and about words she said on camera about 9/11. If asking those questions makes me a racist, then the word racist doesn't mean anything anymore, and that's dangerous. Because when you use that word to deflect every question, you cheapen it for the people who actually experience racism. Real racism. The kind that isn't about Senate hearings, but about getting followed in a store or pulled over for driving in the wrong neighborhood. He paused. I respect Representative Omar's right to defend herself. Calling your questioner a bigot is not a defense. It's an admission that you don't have one. The interviewer asked what was next. Kennedy reached down and picked up a glass of sweet tea that had been sweating on the porch railing. He took a sip and set it back down. That's up to the Department of Justice. That's up to the Ethics Committee. That's up to the people of Minnesota, who are going to have to decide if they want a representative who can't answer simple questions about where her money comes from. He smiled, not the devastating smile from the hearing room, but the quieter one, the one he wore when he wasn't performing for cameras, but just being John Kennedy from Centerville, Mississippi, who ended up in Louisiana and somehow ended up in Washington and still couldn't quite believe either one. My job was to ask the questions. I asked them what happens next is above my pay grade. The interview ended. The Baton Rouge station aired it at 600. It was picked up nationally by morning. Kennedy spent the rest of the evening on his porch watching the sun go down over Lake Pontchartrain. The water was flat and gold and endless, the way it always was at dusk. The pelicans were still diving. Somewhere across the lake, the lights of New Orleans were beginning to flicker on like candles in a window. He had arrived in Washington with one thin folder containing one sheet of paper. He had asked simple questions in a simple draw, and the answers, the absence of them, had done more damage than 1,000 pages of evidence ever could. Because the truth, as Kennedy had always known, doesn't need a thick file. It just needs someone willing to ask for it out loud. The sun set, the pelicans flew home, and somewhere in Minneapolis, Ilhan Omar was learning what the people of Louisiana had known about John Kennedy for years. The gentleman always gets you. with a question you can't answer?